Garrett completed his undergraduate work at Weber State University, and then, while serving a full-time LDS mission in Alabama and Mississippi, Garrett developed a love of the South and decided to go to law school at Florida Coastal Law School. Garrett has always been passionate about liberty. For 2 years, he hosted a radio show called Faith in the Fire. It was on religious liberty and constitutional rights. Garrett continues to advocate for liberty by educating others about the Constitution and the founding principles of America. And Garrett also comes from a really great family, some of whom is here. Would you stand up, Pam? I don't know. Yes. You can stand up too. Really great family. So please welcome Garrett Smith.
All right. I'm going to kind of track my time here as well. Good evening. Well, if you have read the U.S. Constitution cover to cover, can you raise your hand? Awesome. This is good. How many have read it this year? This month? This week? Awesome. Okay. So, yeah, the whole thing. It's only 4,500 words, and so it's not as big as you think it is. But if you haven't read it, that's okay. You're not unique. And I don't know how much we can trust this poll, because 73.1% of statistics are made up on the spot. But about a decade ago, they polled Congress, and 82% of Congress indicated that they had never read the Constitution. That's disturbing. It's also disturbing that they had the confidence to say, I haven't read the Constitution, even though I'm supposed to uphold the Constitution and make laws in line with the Constitution. But it's something that they didn't do. So I'm not suggesting that we have to read the Constitution, every day, every week, every month to understand it. But what I am suggesting is that we need to read it often, and we need to understand what it meant when it was ratified to truly comprehend the foundational principles of our country. Eric talked about rights. We have a lot of rights under the Constitution, and he's correct in saying that a lot of people don't understand what those rights are. Life, liberty, and property are outlined in the Declaration of Independence, as well as the Fifth Amendment, and then throughout our founding documents. We also have rights of privacy, of religion, of due process, of speech. We have all of these rights, but it seems like as of late, they haven't been respected as much as they once were, or as they were intended to be respected. But should it surprise us that our rights are being violated when the people who are supposed to uphold the Constitution haven't read it? Should it surprise us that we don't understand what our rights are as a people, or especially the younger generation growing up, if they haven't read it as well? Have we abdicated that right to the schools, and are they going to do it? Are they going to do it justice? If we've removed the Spirit or God from school, and a lot of our constitutional history is based on God, based on religion, based on morality, then we can't expect a different result. Thomas Jefferson said that if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. We can't support ignorance. We can't say that that's a good thing. Some people say, oh yeah, we're moving in a different direction. The Constitution's outmoded. We've got to move forward. It was designed for a different people. Well, that may be true, but I would rather be those people, because they had the virtue and morals that were capable of allowing us to have freedom. I'm sure some of you have heard Ben Franklin's quote where he said that only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. And I would say right now, when I see things going on across the United States, it's pretty vicious. And in some case, I would say, wow, they need a master because they're out of control. But we don't want to have masters upon us when we aren't vicious. We need to have that religion morality. As Washington said, in his farewell address, let me see, I think I've got it here actually. Yeah, let's see. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. So that's what we should be searching for as we try to be good citizens, but more importantly, good statesmen. Because statesmen understand freedom and understand that wearing a mask doesn't automatically make you a good citizen. Understanding freedom and doing what freedom requires makes you a good statesman and a good citizen as well. So I imagine we all have different levels of constitutional understanding, and so I wanted to just do a quick review of our government system. We actually have a mixed form of government. I was able to go to Montpelier, which is James Madison's home, a couple times in my life, and I sat in the room where he wrote the Constitution, or the Virginia plan that would become the working document for the Constitutional Convention. And as I sat in the room, they said that he read parts of it, over 200 books in 6 different languages from fall, winter, spring before the Constitutional Convention. That's a bright guy. I can barely read books in 1 language, let alone 6, and then understand it and comprehend it to that degree. But he looked at history, he saw which forms of government worked, how they didn't work, and that they took that mixed form of government where now we have, as the founders took it, they emphasized the benefits of each government while providing checks and balances against the negative aspects of some of the government. And so I know probably most of you, since a lot of you have read the Constitution, you could answer this question. What are the 3 branches of government? Okay, I heard them all. So let's start with the legislature. That's broken into 2 houses, right? The bicameral. Well, the House was patterned after a republic, and a republic was supposed to represent the people and do what was in their best interest. Now, the Senate was patterned after the aristocracy, and before 1913, which is a terrible year in history, if you ask me. But the 17th Amendment changed it where they no longer represented the states, but they started representing the people as well, and it was a popular vote. Notice I didn't mention democracy at all, because democracy was considered by the founders to be one of the most dangerous forms of government because it devolves into anarchy. Hence the news, right? I mean, we're seeing the effects right now. So even within that first branch, there were checks and balances before anything could come through, that they had to go through both of those systems, or both of those houses, and be good for not only the states, but for the people that they represented. The executive branch is patterned after the monarchy and has the ability to make decisions quickly, but coming from the King of England, they knew that they had to have checks and balances to prevent that from getting out of hand. The judicial branch is patterned after the technocracy because its members are appointed according to their education in law, their moral values, their experience, their wisdom, and they should be the experts and professionals in their craft. And these 3 branches were designed to separate the legislative, executive, and judicial power so that not one branch would become too powerful over another. And if one branch tried to exert authority it did not have, it was to be checked by the other branches to keep the system of government balanced. So over the years, our mixed form of government has become a mixed up form of government, I would say, because of continuous violations of separation of powers and branches failing to check and balance the other. So you may say, okay, this is all annoying and boring. Well, we have to understand the history of it and what it was supposed to be and see how it's fallen apart to understand how we get it back, to the right place. And so here are some examples where each branch either asserted the power and authority of another branch, punted their own power to another branch, or was not checked by another branch. So which branch of government has the power to declare war? The legislative, good. Up until 1941. No, right? So that was the intent that they had. But Congress, they punted that authority away, virtually. I mean, it's not exactly punted away, But under the War Powers Act of 1941, they said, hey, executive, you can invade a country and you can stay there up to 90 days, and Congress doesn't have to say a word. And then what if Congress pulls them back and doesn't say, okay, let's declare war? We've been there for 90 days and we've ruined their system. No, like we've put them, in a position where now if we left, we'd create an even bigger problem. So they just have to validate what's happened. And so now we're seeing that not only did Congress punt that the wrong way, there wasn't any backlash or any check from the executive saying, hey, no, that's not right, or even the courts saying, no, that's not right. Around the same time, Congress passed another act that limited how much you could grow on your own land. Has anyone heard of Wickard versus Filburn? This is a 1942 case. So Congress says, well, under the Commerce Clause, we're going to say you can't grow crops to feed your own cattle because you've got to buy that from someone else. Well, it can be taxed, right, when there's a sale, so that makes sense. And so they said, we're regulating commerce under the Commerce Clause. The court didn't do what they were supposed to do. They looked at the case and they said, yeah, Congress can do that. And the farmers are like, well, wait a second, I'm just feeding my own cows. I'm not transporting it interstate. There's none of that going on. Well, that may be true, but let's say that all the farmers did what you're doing, and in the aggregate, that would impact interstate commerce. So yeah, you can't do it. You got to buy it from someone else. No wonder it's hard to farm, right? I mean, they just make it so difficult because they want what they want. And once again, the Supreme Court did not check that. So now let's look at the executive. I love Abraham Lincoln and what he was able to do through the war, but some people have said, I have a problem with him suspending habeas corpus because that's so clearly outlined in the Constitution. Well, I have a problem with that too, but he was justifying it under emergency powers. Sound familiar? So, well, it's an emergency, we better do it. So he suspended it then, and then after the war, it went back. Until 2001, we had 9/11, and within 45 days, this 1,000-page Patriot Act was passed. That was record time, right? And it gave the executive the authority to hold enemy combatants indefinitely without all the rights provided by the 5th, 6th, and 7th Amendments. So it goes to the Supreme Court. And in Hamdi versus Rumsfeld, the Supreme Court doesn't push back and doesn't check that power and say, no, you can't violate the 5th, 6th, and 7th Amendments. But they did say, if you're an enemy combatant and also a U.S. citizen, then you still get due process. So, glad we've got due process. But once again, the Constitution, the amendments, these rights, they don't just apply to American citizens. They apply to all people. It doesn't say that this only applies to American citizens. There are certain things that only apply to American citizens, like running for office and voting. But as far as not depriving someone of their life, liberty, and property, that's to all people, to everyone that's been endowed by their Creator with those rights. So let's look at bureaucracies. I think this is probably the biggest issue that we have, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on with the health department. But bureaucracies fall under the executive branch, and they make policies called regulations. They enforce them, and they also have their own adjudicative boards. So have you ever heard of an administrative order? That didn't go to the judiciary. That was all within the executive. And so right there, we have a violation of separation of powers in every bureaucracy, whether state, local, federal. It doesn't matter. That's just a violation that occurs. Child Protective Services, they have all their own regulations. And in one section, it'll say, yeah, you've got to let us in your home. And then in another section, it says, an exception to our rule is you say no, right? Because they understand that there's a Fourth Amendment and that they can't just violate that, but they write the regulations in a way that someone shows it to you and says, hey, look, I can come in your home and I can interview your kid behind closed doors and you can't be a part of it. They don't show you the part that gives the exception that says, say no, right? Just say no. That should be their tagline. So anyway, we'll get back to that as well, but that's how bureaucracies have violated the separation, and there hasn't been a way to check that yet or actively check that. So now we'll jump to the judiciary. Within the judiciary, I'm sure a lot of you have heard the term legislating from the bench. So 1973, Roe versus Wade, the legislature came up with a 3-trimester test, and they legislated from the bench and said, this is what we're going to follow from now on. They didn't say, this is constitutional or not and send it back to Congress to make those choices. They just legislated right from the bench. And it was that violation. They exercised legislative authority. Brown versus Board of Education, this is what I call executive ordering from the bench. And that's not really a coined term as much, but it happened because the court found that they needed to force desegregation in Arkansas. And at the time, this one just boils me a little bit because it makes me really champion the Anti-Federalist Papers 80 and 81, where it says, hey, we're really worried about this Supreme Court because it's the court of no appeal. And it really is. Once it goes there, how do we ever reverse that? Well, here, President Eisenhower could have said, no, I'm not going to dispatch the National Guard and take this over. But that's not what he did. That would have been his way of checking that power and saying, yeah, you don't have the authority to enforce or give an executive order from the bench. I'm just not going to enforce it. And yeah, the judiciary would have had to look pretty silly and, saying that they could do these things and then not, and delegitimizing their power to a degree. But that's what checks and balances are all about, is delegitimizing inappropriate, unconstitutional power. So, I've taken you through that. This is just scratching the surface of the ways that these have been violated over the years, but it gives us an understanding, hopefully, of how these separation of powers are being violated so drastically right now. Okay, understanding history and understanding that this has been going on and there hasn't been enough pushback helps us realize why we're where we're at right now. So let's look at right now. The health department is under the executive branch of the government in Utah. Do we see violations of separations of power as they make policies, administrative orders, and then enforce them and threaten us, right? The violations of separation of powers that we see in our federal and state governments have these decades of precedent. The difference now, in my opinion, is that it seems our state government is emboldened to push the limits of their power even further. And so once again, we need to check and balance that power more than ever. And I'm grateful as I'm looking out, I'm seeing people that are doing that and pulling together coalitions of businesses and other groups. Eric and what he's been doing, right? These are all people trying to push back against that, and that's what we should be doing. So anyway, that's more of the federal and what we've seen go on federally, but the genius of the federal constitution also has been exhibited in state constitutions. And our state has adopted similar structures with the branches and some of the rights that it protects within our state constitution as well. So don't be shy, but please raise your hand if you've read the Utah Constitution cover to cover. Awesome. Okay, good. So there's a couple that have all the way and some that have read some. I have to be honest, I hadn't read it before March of this year because I guess I just hadn't really thought about it. I was so focused on the federal constitution. But when I started seeing what was going on in the state, I wasn't as worried about the federal because it seemed like, it was more saying, hey, we'll leave it up to the states. We're not going to enforce a lot of these mandates, and maybe there were things that were going on behind the scenes. But I started seeing a lot of activity on the state level, and I said, I've got to check this out and see if they can do what they're doing. And so just like the other one, I'm not going to ask you to read it in its entirety and read it often and all that, but it should be referenced often and understood, just like our U.S. Constitution. So I'm going to pull out, I'm just going to share some highlights just to kind of whet your appetite and say, wow, rather than reading, the latest sci-fi book or whatever book you read, I'm going to read the Utah Constitution tonight. So, all right. In the preamble, it says, grateful to Almighty God for life and liberty, we the people of Utah, in order to secure and perpetuate the principles of free government, do ordain and establish this Constitution. Right? I love the phrasing there. So Article 1, Section 1. All men have the inherent and inalienable right to enjoy and defend their lives and liberties, to acquire, possess, and protect property, to worship according to the dictates of their consciences, to assemble peaceably, protest against wrongs, petition for redress of grievances. So similar to, First Amendment, we've got, life, liberty, property. So Fifth Amendment, similar things in there. Let me jump to the due process. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Well, a health administrative order that forces a business to shut down, I would argue, takes away liberty and property without due process of law. But I'm just an attorney, right? No, I'm just I'm not the lawmaker here, right? I'm not the health department, but it seems like a pretty clear violation. Impairing contracts. This is in Section 18. It says, no bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law impairing the obligation of contracts shall be passed. Well, how many contracts were impaired with these shutdowns? There are many people suffering because of that. Enumeration. I love this one. So it's like the Ninth Amendment in the U.S. Constitution. But here it says, this enumeration of rights shall not be construed to impair or deny others retained by the people. So you look at that and it says, oh, well, yeah, I don't really see in the Utah Constitution where it has an amendment or an article that says we don't have to wear a mask, right? I don't see it in there, and so maybe we don't have that right. Or maybe we can just agree that the government can't tell us what to wear. Does that seem more reasonable? And, this isn't a pro-anti-mask issue. It's a question of what's the proper role of government. And the government shouldn't tell us what we have to inject into our body, put on our face, or what job we have to do, right? We have that freedom. Article 1, Section 26 says the provisions of this Constitution are mandatory and prohibitory unless by express words they are declared to be otherwise. So if it says that the legislative power is in the legislature, it's in the legislature. Unless it says otherwise, which it doesn't. I guarantee. I've read it very closely, and it doesn't say that the executive has legislative authority. It does say that the executive can carry out laws. That's in Article 7, Section 5. It says the governor, quote, shall see that the laws are faithfully executed. So they can execute existing laws, but they can't come up with new laws out of a hat or say, here's an executive order and I'm going to extend the order. They can't do that because Article 1, Section 26 prohibits that from happening. So I'm kind of jumping around now. There's a lot of other good ones. One that I thought was interesting was Article 12, Section 20. And this one says that it's the policy of the state of Utah that a free market system shall govern trade and commerce in the state to promote the dispersion of economic and political power and the general welfare of all the people. Each contract combination in the form of a trust or otherwise or conspiracy in restraint or trade or commerce is prohibited. It is also prohibited for any person to monopolize, attempt to monopolize, or combine or conspire with any other person or persons to monopolize any part of trade or commerce. Well, this is what unelected health officials have done in Utah. They've created monopolies where they didn't previously exist. Who would have thought Target was a book sales store? I wouldn't until I heard that they were the number one in-store bookseller during the pandemic. Well, how is that possible? Because unelected health officials, whether intentionally or not, shut all the other bookstores down while allowing big box stores to remain open. So, I mean, is that reasonable? Does that make sense? That, we can't gather in a group of 5 or 10 in this small store, but yeah, hundreds of people can go into that store. We've got to use some reason here. And I'll just put this out there. Some officials are willfully seeking to destroy liberty, but many are ignorantly involved. So what do we need to do? Educate them. We have to educate them. We have to educate ourselves, but we specifically have to educate them because they're making decisions right now. And, there's a lot of ways we can go about this. We've got the legislative, executive, the judicial branches. And, the legislature right now, I think, is a good place to start because they are saying no in some ways. They said, no, we're not going to let you, we're not going to amend it and just allow you to put in an executive order, emergency order for this long. And so that's why Governor Herbert has to keep on enacting it every time it expires. So there is some pushback already. That's a great place to start. The executive, I don't know. Maybe health departments, maybe to educate them. I don't know. I'd like to think that there's still some good in people and we can see them change. And then in the courts. And I know some of you are familiar that we're working on a lawsuit, and I'll be honest, I bit off more than I could chew, because taking on what they call the 800-pound gorilla is no small task, especially because once you file, then they've got a team of lawyers that are supported by our tax dollars coming back against us and filing frivolous motions. And so one of the things that I was going to ask is, if you have connections with any attorneys that have a passion for freedom, have office staff, have the availability and means to support, please reach out to me. I'm currently working with another attorney to see if he can kind of take what I've got and run with it and allow me to help on the way as well. So what's the call to action? We need to read the U.S. Constitution, and we need to understand it. We need to read the Utah Constitution and understand it, and then be informed and teach others about their rights and the limits on government powers, starting with our elected officials. But as we teach others, even if our elected officials don't, believe the few hundred voices, that we start influencing, if this expands and they hear it over and over and then they're not reelected, or, it becomes an issue where they say, I might not get reelected, that's where they're going to start listening. I was hoping, I just saw the 5-minute sign, and I wanted to just point you to a couple other thoughts. There is a book called The Fourth Turning, and I don't know if I heard someone say yes because you've probably been reading it more recently. It was written in 1997, and the subtitle was An American Prophecy, and it talks about cycles of history. And so as we've gone back through the history of our country and we've seen the violations of separation of powers, it helps us understand how that came to be, why that wasn't pushed back on then, and how some heroes have taken us through these previous crises to the point where there was a good order established. Now, when we come through this crisis, do we want people that have a constitutional foundation making decisions? Or do we want those that want communism making decisions, right? I mean, that's kind of the question we're facing right now, because we see a stark divide in America. And as we come back together, we want to have the right foundation, but if we don't have the knowledge, we won't have the foundation. And so looking at history is essential. So this is in chapter 10, and the authors lay out 5 scenarios that they say could happen. And remember, this was written in 1997. And so they say, recall that a crisis catalyst involves scenarios distinctly imaginable 8 or 10 years in advance. Based on recent unraveling era trends, the following circa 2005 scenarios might seem plausible. And then they go and they give 5 scenarios, I think all of which have come to pass in one way or another. But I'll read number 4. See if it sounds familiar to you. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention announced the spread of a new communicable virus. The disease reaches densely populated areas, killing some. Congress enacts mandatory quarantine measures. The President orders the National Guard to throw prophylactic cordons around unsafe neighborhoods. Mayors resist. Urban gangs battle suburban militias. Calls mount for the President to declare martial law. 1997, that was I wish I could have written that prophecy. That was pretty good. And then they go on. It's highly unlikely that any one of these scenarios will actually happen. What is likely, however, is that the catalyst will unfold according to basic crisis dynamic that underlies all of these scenarios. An initial spark will trigger a chain reaction of unyielding responses and further emergencies. I feel like we're in a perpetual state of emergency now to justify the continual actions. My position is, even in an emergency situation, our rights don't disappear. They're still present, and that's the value of the Constitution. That's why we have it, because if they disappeared at every emergency, then we could just manufacture consistent emergencies to a point where we have no more rights. Now is the time to say no, we're not going to do that, Because if we don't say it, and the younger generation who may not understand these principles grows up being indoctrinated into just following whatever's said, then we no longer have freedom. The last thought I'll leave you with: be a wise optimist. I don't have time to go into my whole explanation of what this means, but sometimes learning about history and uncovering the voluminous examples of limiting our rights can make us angry and pessimistic, right? Like hopefully something I said today kind of made you be like, what? I can't believe they did that. So you'll go research it and say, okay, I understand what he was talking about. So I'd like to encourage you in your journey of discovery to maintain the optimism. I think most of us can relate to starting as a foolish pessimist where we say, all is well, like things are okay. And then when we start lifting the cover and we see how things really are, we may get so paralyzed, so angry, so frustrated that we'll just disengage and say, I can't handle that. Man, I can't handle Facebook. Well, that's been me my whole life. I can't handle it anyway. But, I just disengage. I'm not going to speak anymore. I need to, go bunker down somewhere because this is bad, right? But we need to move beyond that, the wise pessimist, and become that wise optimist where we exercise faith, where we have hope in each other, where we say all is not, it's not over. And even if we don't change the outcome of every single piece of legislation that comes about, how many people come to understand the spirit of freedom and liberty in the process of sharing that? We need to speak. George Washington said, if freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led like lambs to the slaughter. So once again, I'd encourage you, read the Utah Constitution, read the U.S. Constitution, educate others, speak. Now's the time to speak more than ever. Be willing to stand out and realize that we can't do this on our own. If you look at the American Revolution on paper, we should have lost that, hands down. Eric mentioned it as well. We need God. We need more than ourselves, because as I look at staring down the government and fighting a battle in the legal field, I feel small, I feel weak. But as we come together and as we rely on God, then we'll have the strength to do things that we otherwise would be unable to do. I'd encourage you to understand cycles of history. I'd recommend reading The Fourth Turning, but most importantly, have faith and choose to be a wise optimist. And I hope that God will bless us in our efforts to not only preserve our liberty, but also to restore liberties that we've lost. Thank you.